Welcome, everybody. My name's Gary Fortney, and this is The Trend.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Strifler. The Trend is a weekly podcast that talks about three main topics: current events, trends in law enforcement, and true crime. Today, we're talking about a case that's local to St. Louis, Ernie Brasier, and we have two of our workers here at Trend Media to help us out with this case. They've researched this intensely and have personal connections to this case as well. So on my right here, we have Larry Boyd, a research specialist. Thank you for joining.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
And we have Tony Piwowarcyzk.
Hi, good afternoon.
Let me try it one more time. Tony Piwowarcyzk.
Yes, good afternoon.
Thank you for joining. So Gary cannot be here to join us today. He is currently teaching at Vista Law Enforcement Training and Consulting, LLC. So we wish him best in his class today. And thank you guys for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to hand it off to Larry now to talk a little bit about the background on this case. Larry?
So what I've learned from my research is Ernie was well liked. He was a quiet man, worked diligently, very thoroughly, started actually his practice out of law school, which was in Mizzou, started in San Antonio with his wife. He was such a quiet, unassuming, nice guy that his wife had a difficult time motivating him to bill his customers. And his point was, well, they just don't have the money. So eventually he moves to St. Louis and he worked for the Hartford. And he worked there for a couple of years downtown. And unfortunately, he was let go, which kind of devastated him because he thought he was doing a good job, but he was very methodical. He's the type of he's like step one, step two, step three in his practice. And that wasn't fast enough for Hartford. They wanted speed to be practical, so they let him go. He was interviewed by Boggs and Bates. He was hired. Boggs and Bates is a law firm that primarily deals with civil litigation defending insurance companies. Okay. Such as you might have had a slip and fall someplace. So that store would have been insured by Fireman's Fund or whoever. And that was their practice. In fact, Ernie was kind of excited because just before his passing, he was given the Fireman's Fund firm for his counsel work, and he was made partner. So along with that, Beth Boggs indicated that he needed to have 50 billable hours per week. So, and that's really how law firms make money.
Right.
Is either they make them on litigation or they make them on billables. And in Ernie's work, since he was primarily defending firemen's, that his job was really to do research, to do consultations, whatever. So he had to really log those hours and minutes so that Fireman's Fund could be billed.
Now, is 50 hours pretty easy to reach, would you say?
That's a great question, because remembering that, or thinking about they have a lot of other things going on through their daily work. Not only are they talking to whoever was, but they may have to do, there may be drive time.
Right.
Okay. Or there may be consultation. It has nothing to do with that client. Then they have to remember to do that.
Keeping track.
Metric. So about this time, there's beginning of specialty software for attorneys to be able to count for their time plus billables. So, but that was kind of a challenge for Ernie because Ernie was just kind of a nice guy. Everybody loved Ernie, but that was kind of a challenge for that law firm, is to make sure his billable hours were enough.
And the concept of billable hours isn't that I'm consulting for an hour. I talked to you for 10 minutes. I note I've talked to you for 10 minutes.
Right.
So within that hour, you could have 6 or 10 billable items.
Okay.
It's a great point.
And keeping track of that is really tough. You can't just generalize and go, I talked to this guy for 30 minutes. I'm going to bill him for an hour. Can't do that.
Right. One point I want to make really quickly is we're not going to jeopardize the police investigation or bring anything up that's not already in the public domain. So while we do have a little bit of background and personal ties to this, we're not going to bring anything up that isn't public knowledge. Next, I want to go into, when this happened. I heard that it was pretty close to Christmas.
Just a bit before Christmas. Ernie was working late Tuesday evening. And he didn't have computer access in his office. So he went to Dan Vinker's office, which Dan was on vacay about that time.
Vince
Vinker. I apologize. He was on vacation.
Well, and let's set the time frame up. It's not modern day. This is 2006.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So not everybody had a desktop. Not everybody had a laptop. So he was going to do some work in that office. And somewhere along his time, someone comes into the office and Ernie was shot. Not right. No one noticed it right away. The janitor was coming through. I believe he's called Preacher. his nickname.
Yes.
And he noticed that Ernie was on the floor. So he goes down a couple of floors to another law firm. A couple of attorneys were working late. He said, hey, there's a man down up on Boggs' office. So the other attorney goes up there. He calls 911, but he didn't really want to get involved. So he said, there's a man down. Police respond. And initially they thought Ernie had a heart attack because he was under the desk. Most of his body was under the desk, and there was a little blood pooled up on the floor, but they thought he probably hit his head on the way down. Okay. They didn't realize that he actually had been shot. So the ME comes over. They take him to the ME's coroner's office. Mary Case starts doing a workup on him and realizes behind his left ear, there's a wound entry. So they performed an x-ray, and there was a 3mm projectile lodged in his brain.
And we're talking that the scene itself was not massive blood loss. It could easily have been viewed as a heart attack because there was nothing askew in the office. Nothing was tore up as if an altercation had taken place.
Good point.
And his chair, and he was just like he had fallen over under the desk.
Yes.
So they really wouldn't know until autopsy, I guess. That
Right. And like you said, the blood loss was attributed to him hitting his head at the time. And there was no reports. There were other people in the building, the other lawyer on the other floor.
Right.
Nobody had heard anything or saw anything out of the ordinary. So
I believe one of the attorneys in the Boggs law firm had just exited the building a little after 6 o'clock going to his car in the parking lot. And his comment was, well, maybe that person was laying in wait, either waiting for Ernie to come out or waiting for the building to be vacated so that person could go in, which I thought was kind of an interesting thought process.
So was the thought that he used, or the killer used, some type of silencer, I guess, then? How did they keep this quiet under wraps? Or was it just that, since it happened in that parking garage, that they thought no one heard?
No, it was in their office building. It was in the offices.
Oh, okay.
It's up on the fourth floor.
What we're getting into next, bombing happened in the parking garage.
No, that was an unrelated.
Different case, unrelated case. Yeah, so how do they think it was kept that quiet?
Well, there were very few people in the building.
Other than the others.
And the offices were segregated. They weren't cubicle type. It was full-size offices with doorways, furniture, and everything in there, and nobody on the floor, occupying the floor that Ernie was on. And the other lawyer was on, I think, the third floor.
Right.
One floor down.
Right.
Okay, so it wasn't like an open concept of the offices, like the cubicles you said. That makes more sense. I heard that, too, there was a lot of workplace tension. Do you both think that led to what happened?
That's a great question because early on, there was some concern that it is very public knowledge that Boggs ran the agency or the firm very tightly. There's a lot of stress.
Talking about Beth.
Yes. A lot of stress. Darren was a totally different personality, but that she was the managing partner. So she was responsible for income and assignments of accounts and what are we doing? In fact, there was a point in time where everybody used one email address so she had eyes on every email that came in and out of the office. And again, this is very public. I think it was reported in the Riverfront Times, I believe.
And didn't she also, as managing partner, and having such a hold, view billable hours before the bills were sent?
That is what is reported. And then that, again, if you're an attorney working on cases, you're always under the microscope in that kind of an environment and that kind of a stressor. It's like, am I doing a good enough job? Because now I've got my boss always looking over my shoulder. And am I in a good position to stay here? Am I making enough money for the office?
Yeah. And like you said, Ernie's work ethic was very meticulous in how he did things, and it wasn't scattered. It was methodical. And so having that stress on top of somebody telling you have to have your 50 billable hours and watching you all the time,
Right.
But magnify that by every associate that was in the law hired for that law firm. There were 25 associates.
Yeah.
Wow. So she was very much micromanaging.
Yeah. So Pat, his wife, after Ernie's death, she was interviewed for the Riverfront Times article. In fact, she wrote a book about this. But she would drive Ernie around while he would dictate his cases or notes or whatever. So again, he would be getting those billable hours so that he was not having vacant time and that he could keep a minimum of those 50 hours up or he was facing a pay cut.
Wow.
And he was supporting 3 kids and a wife.
Yep. And the kids were in private school, which
Immense pressure.
we know, in parochial schools, it can get darned expensive, especially at the middle and high school levels.
Yeah, especially in St. Louis.
Yes, yes.
We have so many options for that. And the question always is, where'd you go to high school?
Yeah. And then in this case here, being parochial and private, where does the money come from?
Exactly.
From Ernie's billable hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Pat was a partner in nursing practice. So she had that income, but I think the real workhorse was Ernie's income.
Right.
That's my interpretation of reading these articles and doing the research.
So let's hop back to Beth for a second. You said that, or I think you said that she had eyes on the billable hours for
Yes.
most of it. There was some unethical billing practices that have come to light. Do you think she had any hand in that?
Well, there were complaints made to the Attorney General through anonymous sources. I think there was a letter of, correct me, Larry, was a letter of reprimand.
So she was hauled into the bar in Jeff City.
Okay.
I always say haul, but she had a hearing in the bar, and she was accused of billing other attorneys' hours under her billing number, which that could be interpreted possibly that because her billing rate may be higher.
Okay.
Possibly. I'm not sure of that, but as the managing partner. So she got a letter of reprimand, and I think it lasted for a few years. She wasn't suspended, but when that happens, eyes kind of get cast.
Right. So a reprimand, in a sense, what happens when she's reprimanded? Do you know?
She went back to practice. So she wasn't DQ'd from practicing. She wasn't suspended. She could continue on with practice, but that was an admonishment that her practices were outside the scope of what was legitimate practice at that time.
Okay. So does it just go on her license as like a note?
Probably in her file.
Okay.
Yeah, because again, every year they renew their license, and they have to have so many CEUs, a lot like police force does, to keep their license active. So yeah, so that could have had an effect on her license.
Well, and at the time, the firm just had 3 partners, which was Beth Boggs, her husband, Thomas Darren, who went by Darren Boggs, and Mark Bates.
Right.
So it was Boggs, and Bates at that time.
Right.
That was in 2000.
And you guys said they had up to 25 associates or something like that?
Well, I think that included partners, didn't it, Tom?
Okay.
Yeah.
So everyone had to have these 50 billable hours.
Right.
And maybe some had to have more. If you are low on the totem pole, they're going to expect more out of you.
Wow. Is that, I don't know, for that many people to be fighting for that, it might be pretty competitive in the office of itself. Or is that something that's easy for law firms to achieve?
I think a lot of it's going to be like the junior lawyers are going to be assigned more senior lawyers, companies they're representing, the amount of cases they have that they pass work on to the associates. So it's not like you're all standing at a door waiting for somebody to come in and jumping.
Right.
It's set cases that have to be distributed, but it's just creating your billable time and finding time to have a real life besides out of the workplace.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you're working just 50 billable hours a week. I mean, you got to be working an extreme amount then. You probably don't have much family time.
Well, plus, if you look at the reason I think they had to have so many hours is there's administrators. You have paralegals, administration, research people that don't litigate cases. They are doing the research. They are helping the trial attorneys or the litigators prepare their cases, do the research for their cases, and all of that goes into billable hours. But of course, it also still costs out of that case. It costs money.
For sure. Do you know how many paras were in the office?
I do not. I didn't find a resource for that.
Okay. I'd be curious because, I mean, you'd think they have at least a couple for as many people that work there.
Well, I would think they have more than that.
Yeah, and plus secretaries that do answering the phones, transcribing.
Reception, sure.
As you said, Ernie would dictate notes, so somebody has to transcribe that.
Right.
Good point, Tony.
And that adds all to the head count of people that could have known something. I believe the case is still open and ongoing.
It is. From my understanding, it gets looked at least once a year. Am I correct, Tony, by Clayton?
They still have it on an active roster that it does get reviewed quite frequently to see if any new leads come in. Anytime there's an article that appears, it generates talk. It generates leads. There was a lot of talk because this was in the heart of Clayton, less than a block away from St. Louis County Police Headquarters and the St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, and the Boggs and Bates law firm was well known.
Yes.
And again, this is in 2006. Their reputation, Beth had her own reputation and the firm had its own reputation. And as you said, in this case here, Ernie was working late and he was in another partner, Dan Bennett's office. So that in itself created, some initial concern that was Dan Bennett the target. Dan Bennett was on a leave of absence at the time in Costa Rica, trying to get a business off the ground with his son.
And I think he was going through some marital issues himself, which sometimes he was out of the office. Other witnesses described to the police that they could hear him shouting into the phone, those things. That led to, I think it's a good point. Could he have been the target?
Yeah, and since it's still under review, it sounds like on an annual basis and pretty frequently, if anybody knows something, please feel free to reach out and discuss it with us if you want to stay anonymous.
Following up on how Beth controlled the firm, other events happened later that I became intimately involved with Beth and Darren Boggs. But my understanding, and that was in 2010, this whole time, there were people that came and went from the firm, but many people were very hesitant to speak out or speak their mind when asked about how things were. Very few people came out and expressed issues they had when they were there. And that continued from '06 and through my separate investigation in 2010. The people were very weary of saying anything against, and most often it was regarding Beth Boggs and her control of the firm or the way she managed people.
Well, didn't the firm hire Scott Rosenblum to be their voice to the news media and to law enforcement? Because I think at one time, weren't there 20 or 25 detectives assigned to major case on this case?
Yes, Major Case Squad
Yes.
came in and investigated it. In fact, Gary was working. He was on duty the night that it happened, and they wondered what was going on with the siren, the police presence, the ambulance, which was only a block away from where they were headquartered. And Clayton Police did bring in the Major Case Squad very early on due to the amount of people involved in the firm and that it had to do with lawyers and the various business practices and companies they were involved with and they represented.
And you had a shooting in the heart of Clayton, so that raised a level of concern that we've got to solve this case. We've got to ensure the public that we're a safe city.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that shootings happen all over St. Louis all the time, but not specifically in Clayton too often.
And not back in 2006. Now, Tony could better speak to that. He was a police officer at that point, so he could better speak to the crime stats back then.
I was with ATF then, but no, that is true. But it happened in a law firm, in their office.
Right.
In Clayton. So,
I want to get into the last person that saw Ernie alive. Vince Vector.
Vince Vector, yes. He's the one that left about 6 o'clock. I think it was 6 o'clock, I believe is his testimony, went out to his car.
Is he a main suspect?
He did get questioned because he was the last one. He left supposedly at 6. His testimony last 6 o'clock. I don't believe there were any cameras that captured any entrances or exits. So they were going by his word plus everyone else's word that they were interviewing. But yeah, he was under suspicion for a bit of time, only because probably he was, or not only because, but he was the last guy to see him.
Are there any other suspects?
Yeah. So Dan, who went to the Caribbean, he was under suspicion also, because there were words that he was angry during the office. And it wasn't necessarily, I think that they could have been possibly misinterpreted.
Okay.
Because he was having personal issues. But it seemed like everybody loved Ernie.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to a T. In fact, his daughter worked for the firm for a bit. She worked in billing and administration. She worked there for several months. But he was a guy that everybody loved. He was like everybody's grandpa or something. He was a guy you could go out and have a beer with, and just a nice guy. Everyone's description. Yeah.
One that would be of
Exactly.
someone's top of mind.
Exactly. One of the theories that Clayton Police or Major Case, whichever, could this have been a revenge
For a case.
He works on cases that he was defending insurance companies in civil matters. So it's not like criminal. He's not dealing with criminal trials or criminal cases. He's dealing with civil issues.
Do either of you know what time the autopsy put time of death, or a range of where time of death was? Okay.
He was officially at 10 o'clock at night, Mary Case. That was the discoveries that 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 he actually was shot. But when the PD showed up, again, they believed that at 7 o'clock or there shortly, because they were just a few minutes away, the responding officer, that he had died of a heart attack.
Right.
He had no presence of life when the attending officer was there.
Okay. So somewhere between that 6 and 10 is.
Well, 6 and 7
Closer to 7, yeah, between 6 and 7.
was found. So.
Yeah. So again, unfortunately, no cameras. There weren't any key cards. There were people like getting through doors or whatever, through entrances to know, access. It was all open access back then.
Right. Well, and yeah, again, it's almost 20 years ago versus the access that buildings have now with the amount of cameras, the technology for key cards, limited access. Things were pretty wide open.
Right. And not saying that anyone did it, but do you guys think that Vince does know something that maybe he's not letting on because of the way things were ran from the perspective of Beth?
Well, nothing came about. Nothing was said. I mean, Vince is no longer with us. He died.
Right.
Didn't he have a heart attack?
He did.
Along with Dan Bennett. Both of them within the year following Ernie Brasier's death.
Yeah, about
Ernie
2007.
Brasier's murder, I should
Very
say.
sad.
2007, 2008, in that time frame.
Very sad. So anything they might have known could have.
Well, I meant in that before their Dan Bennett and Vince Vanker, they didn't indicate before their deaths that they knew anything.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
They had been questioned thoroughly, and no arrests had been made.
Right. There were no arrests, no charges. Yeah.
No, at times people were brought in for questioning longer than others based upon interviews that had come up and were uncovered by the major case squad, but there was never an arrest.
Okay.
There was a lot of suspicion, on Vince Vanker because of the time he left, some internal issues between Vince and Ernie. But then Ernie was in Dan Bennett's office.
Right.
The firm engaged in had a lot of lawyers and engaged in a lot of business in the St. Louis area. So as Larry said, it wasn't criminal work,
Right.
but it's fairly contentious work when you're dealing with victims, fighting insurance companies, and you're representing an insurance company and you're the one telling them insurance company doesn't recognize this or is denying this. So there's a lot of emotions that are from the part of the insured, not the insurance companies, but the individual insured that you're dealing with as these cases move through their system.
Right. And we've sure seen in the news recently how crazy that can be when insurance companies are involved. We did an episode on that. I believe it came out a couple weeks prior when this will air on the suspect in the United Healthcare murder for Luigi Mangione. So yeah, we can sure see how that can affect
Right.
the state of mind. I want to get in a little bit to the relation of the bombing at the Boggs residence. Tony, can you tell us a little bit about that?
At the time, I worked for Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF. I was a CFI and a certified explosive specialist. So I worked every day with St. Louis City at the time, but now it's St. Louis Metro Bomb and Arson Squad. So the bombing came out early in the morning, and I responded, and so did St. Louis Metro Bomb Squad. I ended up working the case with Detective Mike Wilner, who recently retired from St. Louis City Bomb and Arson after 29 years in that unit. But we had there was a large law enforcement presence at that time. It was early in the morning at their residence I forgot their address.
They were in Kirkwood. Is that what you're asking?
No, it was in the Carondelet area.
Who are we talking about?
We're talking about Beth and Darren Boggs.
I thought they were. You could be right. I thought they lived in Kirkwood.
No, Mark Bates lived in Kirkwood.
That's right. He did. That's right. It's who they accused of harboring ill will, and they wanted the police to investigate him.
But so in that early morning, there was two separate devices that functioned in the backyard. The Boggs house was a two-story, and it had a detached garage. There was a device that was placed near the back of the Boggs residence, and another device was placed near the detached garage.
Was the detached garage kind of on the side or in the backyard area?
In the back, in the
Okay.
backyard. The driveway ran alongside the house and then ran to an area where you would pull straight in, or you could turn to back in.
And they were both placed in the backyard. How interesting. And that was in 2010, you said?
Yeah, was it October 1st?
Okay. So how did they link this to be related? Was it just that the people were involved?
Well, it was at Beth and Darren's house.
Right. Did they think that it had anything to do with the murder of Ernie?
That topic was investigated during our investigation of the bombing. It wasn't considered right off the bat. No, we had no preconceived notions going in. We just worked the scene and tried to determine what the devices were. There were no injuries other than Beth did say that her feet had been burned when she went out the back door after hearing the devices go off. She said she burned it on the hot concrete, but there were no injuries from the devices themselves. It was property damage to the house and then to the siding of the garage.
From your guys' investigation, do you believe that they were trying to hurt them?
At the time the devices detonated, there was no indication that anybody was on that first floor level or near where the devices were detonated. It appeared to be more as, you know what you did, or you know I'm watching you, or you've done something to me, and I want you to know that I haven't forgotten you.
Right. It's a scare tactic, in a sense.
Yes. And two devices, the second one by the garage, it was a multi-car garage. So that was definitely something separate that, Larry, you knew Beth and Darren on a personal level. And,
I did.
And that couple as a dynamic factors in to a lot of things that occurred at the law firm and in relations with other people.
So on the personal level, when Beth was out of the law office, she was extremely personable. She was caring. She would take groups of people to Cardinal games, to football games, to hockey games. She would provide the tickets. She would provide the refreshments, even the dessert cart that comes around. She would facilitate that. She loved entertaining kids. She had no children of her own, so they would get jerseys or hats or whatever. Every year she operated a shoes for kids, and her firm collected those, and then they would go through some type of restoration, whatever. So then she would deliver those to agencies who could get them to children so they could have dry, warm feet. That was the kind of person she was on the personal side, that's the Beth Boggs I knew. Because I got to go to baseball games and hockey games, and one of my close friends worked with her through a different agency, but she was always kind to me. Darren was always nice, and that's what I saw her interact with every day outside her agency.
And in my interactions from an official capacity, I dealt with Beth in the professional sense, and that's the side I saw. Now, Beth she had one or two muscle cars, and those were housed in that detached garage. Darren was a very easygoing, very likable individual.
Absolutely.
And when Detective Willner and I were dealing with Beth and Darren, Beth took the lead a lot in our questions, and the answers that we received were directed through her. And Mike Willner and I found that it wasn't lack of cooperation. It's that there was a wall that was there, that we were not getting the full picture of who could be responsible for this bombing, who had reason, who had personal grudges. I mean, it was, in the proverbial sense, pulling teeth. You didn't ask the right question, well, you didn't get an answer, or you didn't get an answer to that question that led you to another because they offered something.
It's public record, but didn't they being Beth, believe it was Mark Bates that was responsible for the bombing? Maybe not directly, but...
For a period of 2 weeks, Mike and I had not heard the name other than to hear the name Mark Bates as a former law partner.
Right.
That was it. It wasn't until that we developed, through our resources, a particular purchase of two specific items that were used in both devices through a Home Depot that we uncovered surveillance video of an individual buying items specific to those two devices, very specific. And it wasn't until we showed that video to Beth and Darren when Beth looked at us and says, oh, that's Mark Bates in the video.
Wow.
It was 2 weeks before we heard his name as a viable suspect as to who had previous issues with Beth and Darren Boggs or the Boggs law firm. So that was kind of telling to us that somewhere along the way, we didn't ask the right questions. People associated with the law firm were not very forthcoming about prior employees who had issues. So, and I use that as an example that it took 2 weeks to get that out of, almost 2 weeks for us to really hear his name as a viable suspect.
So did Mark leave the law firm?
I believe it was around 2008 that he left.
Interesting.
Separated.
Right in between.
And there was a lot of tension around that separation.
Okay. Because he was a major partner, or what was the tension?
Well, being a partner and you leave a law firm, whether you do it of your own volition or the other partners like firing you, you're going to lose income.
Right.
So now Mark had to go. Again, I'm not sure if he was let go or if he left to pursue other opportunities, but that adds a level of stress.
For sure. Was there anyone that was suspected other than Mark?
Interviewing other people in the law firm, we developed individual names and lists of who had issues. And Detective Willer and I were working on that as to how large of an issue they had. Would it be motive to construct these two devices and detonate them in their backyard?
Right.
Would it rise to that level? But once we determined who purchased specific items that were involved in the manufacture of those two devices, our focus became solely on Mark Bates, which was resulted in a federal search warrant that we did at his residence. I think it was October 22nd at his home in Kirkwood.
Has he since been charged with anything?
There have been no criminal, federal, or state level charges brought against Mark Bates as a result of this incident. There was civil issues that went back and forth between Beth and Darren Boggs and Mark Bates on the civil side for a number of years, I believe through 2012.
Wow, okay. So how come, was it lacking in evidence other than that stuff? Or what was the reason, I guess, that someone didn't charge him, even though you guys had some of that evidence?
I can't speak for the United States attorney at the time. All I was advised through the assistant U.S. attorney that I was working with is that charges would not be issued.
Okay. Fascinating. I wonder why.
Well, it's, on the surface, you have to look at it's involving all lawyers, contentious issues in a law firm. And past that, I don't know what was at play behind the scenes. I was never made privy to if there was anything going on. Mm-hmm. The public can see, which is in the public domain, the video. And that's why I speak freely with Mark Bates's name, of him purchasing those items. And that gave us the probable cause for the search warrant for his residence.
Right.
Mark and his wife, and when were cooperative during the federal search warrant, they did not make themselves available to answer questions in our investigation. We received no stonewalling as far as having to go through other people or other attorneys when investigating this with them or with Beth or Darren. It's just, there was just a lack of expounding on answers, making us aware of everything that was going on.
So you didn't have, if I'm hearing this correctly, so you weren't provided enough information to be able to start connecting dots because you weren't getting enough information, or they weren't answering your questions that could help you solve the case.
No, I wouldn't say help solve the case. It was trying to determine who was responsible for the bombings in the early stages, the first 2 weeks. There wasn't a lot of guidance or expounding on answers when we asked questions to guide us the right way. Then once we developed Mark Bates, there was even less answers from people associated with the law firm or previously associated as to their involvement or their knowledge, or if there was anything continuing that was current. I mean, there had been no suits filed by either party against each other. Right. Only after the bombing did Beth and Darren sue Mark Bates and try to get a restraining order, temporary restraining order, which wasn't granted, and then tried to get a full order of protection, which was not granted also. And then the civil suit went away, and I believe it finally went away in sometime 2013.
Did they ever seek financial compensation for the damages to the outside of their home?
That was part of the civil suit that the Boggs brought against Mark Bates. But the case was dismissed in St. Louis County courts by Judge Byron Hettenbach, June 24th of 2016.
Wow.
The case hung in the civil courts.
Wow. So a lot of ongoing connections for this law firm specifically. A lot of things happening for them. Anyone think that Ernie wasn't necessarily the target the first time?
That is a question everybody asks because of, as Larry stated, Ernie's position in the firm. He didn't, his persona was not confrontational. He was methodical in his work. He completed his work and his assignments thoroughly. He didn't ruffle anybody's feathers.
Everyone described him as like a nice guy. The people he worked with, they loved to go to lunch with him. In fact, just before his death, there was a luncheon scheduled that next day with some of his staff. And one of the women that he worked with had a CD for him.
Wow.
Okay. That he liked. And she bought it for him. Again, because they were all close friends. Which is a tribute to Ernie of the kind of man he was.
Is there anything ongoing that we haven't touched on yet that you guys want to discuss briefly?
There was a $50,000 reward in the Ernie Brasier murder case. I believe that's still active.
My understanding is it's still out there.
When you ask if Ernie might have been mistaken, there were other players involved in this that investigators had more reasons to look at them, as in Dan Bennett's relationships with people at the time, his personal life, and Vince Vinker. But both those individuals died within the year after Ernie Brasier's murder. So if anybody has any secrets, if either of them had any, they took it to the grave with them.
Right.
And if any members of the employees or associates, current or former, have anything, nothing has been provided to Clayton Police Department.
Did Ernie and Darren look similar? Do you guys know?
Darren, you're saying Darren Boggs?
Yes. Did Ernie and Darren similar at all?
Wait, Darren had gray hair. He wore glasses. I don't believe he wore glasses that I'm aware of, unless they were reading glasses. They were both big guys. I think the Riverfront Times described him as Ernie being pot-bellied. Didn't experience Darren being pot-bellied, right. But he was a good-sized guy. But what went into consideration with that too is there was not a large amount of blood at the scene.
Right.
So the murderer was in fairly close proximity to Ernie when the shot was fired. So whether you would recognize somebody as not being the intended target, anybody's guess.
Yeah, I would think if they're pretty close to them, you would have to know. But I guess we don't know.
No, that's the thing is, these are assumptions.
Right.
Yeah. Because the entry room was behind his left ear, covered by his hairline. So, yeah. And at .22 caliber, I guess you'd have to be, you're the experts. Would the assailant have to be pretty close for that bullet to get through his skull?
Depending upon how good of a shot you are and exactly where it entered in proximity. This is a soft area behind.
Yeah, you have that soft spot
But it wasn't multiple shots, so it's not like somebody was firing randomly.
Right. Well, I want to thank you guys for joining on the podcast today to talk about this. If anyone does have any information, we urge you to reach out. Again, there is that $50,000 bonus. Is it for any information, or is it for any information that comes to the...
I'm sure it would, any information that led to an arrest as a reward.
Right. Just anything helps. Make sure to reach out and visit our website at www.trendmediallc.com for any upcoming episodes. You can also click on our listen here button to get to the episodes. And we have information on everyone here as our guest if you'd like to learn more. We have some introduction episodes as well. Or you can email us at thetrend@trendmediallc.com. Thank you for tuning in, and stay curious and stay part of the trend.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this episode of The Trend. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us at The Trend's website at www.trendmediallc.com, or you can email us at any time at thetrend@trendmediallc.com. We welcome everybody's comments, suggestions, or reviews. Don't forget to stay connected with us on social media. Follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Trend Media Podcast, and join the conversation on Facebook by searching The Trend Podcast. Check out our Amazon page through the link on our website, where you'll find some of our recommended products. We'll be back next time with more true crime stories, insights on law enforcement trends, and current trends with our region and the people we serve. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay part of The Trend.